They're okay with being reported, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Artist judging and decision.
I won't be suing anyone I consent.
Alright. Everyone's ready? Yes. Honorable judges, esteemed colleague, and worthy opponents, thank you all for being here. On June 2015, Iraqi forces in Iraq gave up. There is no more Iraqi army. After the United States had already spent billions of dollars trying to train this army and trying to get it to function without the aid of the United States, it fell flat on its face when it came up against the forces of ISIS. So it is for this reason, and because ISIS is a force for evil in the world, that we as the Affirmation believe that the United States federal government should significantly increase deployment of ground troops against ISIS in Iraq. Now, our plan will define the resolution. Significantly increase is there are 1,200 ground troops right now. Our plan actually will be including sending 1,000 people, U.S. Special Forces members, as parts of strike teams to Iraq to work with the Iraqi government to determine targets. So we will be the Iraqi army for them. And we will not be a regular ground troop army. Essentially, we're going to use the best that the United States has to offer, which is the United States Special Forces. Since there are only 2,500 active members of the U.S. Special Forces, 1,000 of those people being deployed is certainly significant. And is more significant than an equivalent or even greater number of regular ground troops. So we definitely meet that significant burden. And we're going to deploy them as soon as possible, and so that we will be under the guidance of the Iraqi government. They'll be choosing the targets. We'll be acting as the enforcer, essentially. We will be sending these strike teams out as soon as possible. So at that, before I get into my three voting issues, advantages, we ask, do our opponents have any questions about our plan?
So just to clarify your plan, you're sending, just real quick, you're sending U.S. Special Troop Forces, and the Iraqi government is going to choose, it's like going to control them and choose the targets?
To some extent. We're sending the United States Special Forces. We're sending 1,000 of those people as parts of strike teams. We're going to work with the Iraqi government so that they are allowed to choose targets and cities that will be striked, and we will be doing the enforcing. So at that, our first advantage is that strike teams have worked in the past. So in the past, they've been the most effective tool that the United States has at their disposal. In the first 3 months of the Afghan war, the Northern Allegiance beat the Taliban easily because they were using strike teams and strike teams alone. Those strike teams were able to deliver amazingly targeted attacks with great precision. But the moment that they stopped, after those first 3 months of the Afghan war started to drag on for years and years, because everything else that we tried was, simply put, less effective. And the reason why strike teams are so effective, even more effective as drones, as we'll be getting into later in our case, is that they allow for more careful targeting. You can see and pick targets out, and you're able to not only kill people and kill targets and eliminate targets, but you're also able to capture information and documents without destroying them with Hellfire missiles, as is our alternative most of the time. So we have a very precise measure of striking enemy targets rather than alternatives. And so that's the reason why strike teams have worked in the past. And that means when we're using the most effective tool that we have at our disposal, we're not resorting to regular ground troops, which have immense margins of error. Up to 60% of the people that ground troops, when deployed, kill are civilians. Strike teams are not the same. In fact, they have a better attack rate than drones, which are down to 12 or 20% respectively. And that's really generous because drones, as my partner will get into later in her speech, allow for pretty much anyone to be called a combatant because it's really hard to determine who is a civilian and who is a militant after everyone is dead. So at that, we're not using drones. We're not using ground troops. We're using the most effective measure. And that most effective measure is United States Special Forces strike teams in the United States. So at that, since we're using the most effective thing, we create the least loss of civilian life. And the least loss of civilian life is best in this case because ISIS is a terrorist organization. And they gain their recruitment by saying, look how many civilians were killed by the United States here. They're using those as tactics. When the United States messes up, when other countries mess up and accidentally kill innocent people, that just adds more people into the ranks of ISIS. So because we prevent that from happening by using the most effective measure at our disposal, that should be preferred. But secondly, the alternatives are unsustainable. Since drone strikes in the United States, or drone strikes against ISIS, are the alternate, essentially, not only have we proven that they're bad, but they're also unsustainable. We cannot simply go on like we are. The post-traumatic stress disorder among drone strike pilots is higher than any other branch of the military. That means that when we're only training 300 drone pilots per year, and they have an average life expectancy or job expectancy of 9 months, that we aren't meeting a replacement rate because these people are getting PTSD and having to leave too quickly. So we will have a shortage of pilots to a point where we will no longer be able to execute drone strikes, which means we need an alternative, and this is the alternative that we provide. So if we go on in the status quo, we won't be able to solve any problems at all. If we keep going with drone strikes, we won't be able to fight ISIS at all because we will no longer have any pilots because of the PTSD rates. But also there's an increased, ISIS is now hiding in cities rather than resorting to like small camps outside of cities in order to combat drone strikes, because they know that drones will not strike them when they're in densely populated cities. But that's something that essentially strike teams can do. They can strike in the midst of a densely populated city without worrying about killing innocent civilians because they aren't using Hellfire missiles. Strike teams are much, much more precise. So because we can't keep on using drones because they won't work in the future and we won't have anyone to pilot them, and because the alternate is United States Special Forces troops, which is much, much more effective, those are two reasons to prefer strike teams. But third and finally, and my partner will get into this a lot more later, the soft power that the United States can reap from this is immense. We are joining a 40-country coalition against ISIS. When the United States joined in the first place, it led other huge nations like Canada and Turkey to also join that fight, who had stated previously that they would not join the fight against ISIS. So when the United States joins, other people do too. We can set precedents, we can get people to follow us. So for that reason, Judge, we urge your vote in favor of the affirmation.
Could you tagline the intentions?
Strike teams past precedents, alts unsustainable, soft power in the United States.
You guys done off-time roadmaps?
Yes, please.
Just give me
Yes.
okay, cool. Off-time roadmap, I'm going to go topicality T-shell, then I'm going to go net case, app case.
How many sheets for the next case?
Hold on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like that. We're going crazy. Alright, it's... Oh, wait, yeah, let me get you.
So make case first and then not case.
Yes, sir, after the topicality check. Okay, so we all good now? Yeah. Okay. Alright, starting my time. Okay, starting my time now. First of all, we go quick thank yous, but jumping right in. First of all, going into this topicality show. The interpretation here is the fact to be the definition of ground troops. Now, first of all, ground troops are specifically stated as the United States. We believe they should just be your basic United States military ground troops, your basic military troops, everyone that applies and becomes troops. Maybe Army, Navy, they never really specify the division, but Army, Navy, Marines, things such as this, that's the term. The violation. I would like you to point you to their speech. We are not using ground troops. Clear and direct violation of the resolution, which clearly states deployment of ground troops. Whoa. Protected talk. Anyways, so like I was saying, the fact of the matter is as soon as they admit to the fact the violation is clear here, as soon as they say we are not using ground troops, they bite right into this copycat shell. And so therefore that's the violation. They stated they weren't using ground troops, so they bite right into the violation. The standards, first of all, predictability. Well, the resolution says ground troops, so we're going to predict ground troops. So as soon as they say we're not using ground troops, then we lose ground on all of the things that we were actually going to run because we can't predict that they're not going to use ground troops in a resolution that says ground troops. Also, bright line, well, it's pretty obvious that they're going to use ground troops. Also going to run a grammar. Grammar is the fact that, well, it says ground troops. I don't think you can define it as not ground troops. As soon as they say not ground troops, they bite into this. And then going into after the standards, then going into the voter issues, which is going to be that of education. First of all, it takes away from the educational value of the debate. I can't debate on a resolution that they're completely changing. As soon as they say no ground troops, then I can't really debate on that. And then I'm also going to run that. It's also a real world issue. We might as well just quit doing debate if affirmation teams are going to completely ignore the resolution in the debate and say, hey, well, it says ground troops, but we're not going to do ground troops. There's no way for them to get out of this. If they do, it would be a moving target argument, which I will call them out on. They said we are not using ground troops. This is an a priori issue. You should vote on this first. You should vote on this on the top. So at the moment that they say we are not using ground troops, they lose the entire round. Your question?
So you misquoted me, actually. I said we're not using regular ground troops. But when you say ground troops should be defined as the United States military, we say that strike teams are actually members of the United States military.
Okay, well, now they're changing the advocacy and say, okay, well, now we're not using regular ground troops. So then guess what? Okay, you can kick the T-shell if they're really going to use that. But I would actually, you know what, fine, kick the T-shell because I don't feel like wasting time over this. It's not full weight. I kick the T-shell. They're changing. I'm not going to waste time. We can beat them anyways. So first, going into the first neg advocacy, which is to be that of squo solves. Now, first of all, what is the claim on this? It's the fact that ISIS actually, so what is the warrant? The claim is the fact that the status quo solves. What is the warrant for this? ISIS has recently lost 9% of its territory, according to the analysts from the IHH, as well as the fact that ISIS is fighting on multiple grounds at once, and they are overstretched, as well as the fact that they have recently lost the cities of Kobani, Sinjar, and also multiple other major cities, due to who? The Iraqi Kurds have been defeating ISIS recently, and have actually been taking over their territory in the past months and a few years. So therefore, the status quo solves with the Iraqi Kurds, but they also said that the Iraqi has no military. Well, in Iraq, the Iraqi Kurds are still considered a part of Iraq. They're the Iraqi Kurds, so therefore they are still considered a part. They can be attributed to the Iraqi military, and therefore, since they're solving, the fact is that also ISIS is focused more on governing rather than actually, which is distracting them from the war. They're more focused on governing their territory that they already have, which distracts them from the war. So the fact of the matter is the status quo is solving. If they've lost 9% of their territory, if they've lost all these major cities, guess what? What is the impact coming out of this? Squo solves better. Because guess what? I'm going to explain to you all the negatives of basically sending ground troops over there, including loss of lives and these different major impacts. But the impacts coming out of just this contingent, the fact that the squo solves, is why I changed something that isn't broken. So therefore, you can see the impacts coming out of the status quo solving is you're going to stop ISIS, you're going to have a less loss of life. They're doing it efficiently. If they keep doing it efficiently, you have less civilians harmed. You have more intel because they're actually over there doing this and they know exactly more pinpointing on ISIS. And therefore, you see ISIS being stopped quicker without any extra intervention and all the disadvantages that I'm going to show you that they bite into. First disadvantage is going to be that of historical precedent. The claim is the fact that it won't work. The warrant, ISIS currently has 200,000 troops right now. I don't understand how 1,000 troops is going to stop 200,000. First of all, that's their first problem. It won't work. And also, currently, is going back to historical precedent. The last time the United States was in Iraq, we had 150,000 troops, and yet we still failed. We were planning on being out of Iraq within 6 months, had 150,000 troops, and yet we still failed. So as you can see here, the warrant is not going to work. Internal links. If it doesn't work, U.S. lives can be lost for no reason, as well as the fact that the war will continue, and you will see an increased loss of lives and an increase in anti-U.S. sentiment. Therefore, what are the impacts coming out of these internal links? Is you have more death because these troops are going to be killed. They cannot outfight 200,000 people. So as the fact is you have possible riots in the United States of America for sending troops up there to die, sending 1,000 troops to combat 200,000 people, and they obviously don't agree with it. You see riots here, loss of life, violence, crime, all these different negative impacts coming out of this. Going to the second one, going into our second dis-ad, which is going to be that of anti-U.S. sentiment. So first of all, going with that is the fact of the matter is the claim. By sending U.S. troops to kill ISIS members, those ISIS members and their families will have more anti-U.S. sentiment. The warrant, the fact that, well, when the U.S. kills the people in the Middle Eastern, if we are killing ISIS people and also we could possibly be killing civilians, the fact is they will use this as propaganda. They use this as propaganda, therefore they're able to recruit more people. They recruit more people, ISIS becomes stronger. What happens when ISIS becomes stronger? The internal links, ISIS becomes stronger, more people die. Why is that bad? Well, people are dying. So then the impacts coming out is you have more people dying, you have ISIS getting bigger, ISIS getting stronger, and you have more atrocities being committed. Now, going into the next one, which is going to be that of lives. Now, first of all, going into this first contention, which that last our third disadvantage is that of lives. The claim there will be loss of lives. As of March of 2015, 250,000 innocent lives, civilians have died because directly correlated to United States military intervention, including ground and air strikes. Now, I know they talked about drones and all that, but this is also due to ground troops being over there. And as well as the fact is that they were killed in war zone. People were killed in their home, markets, roads, they've been killed by ground troops. Now, what does this do? This escalates the war. Now, what are the internal links here? Well, people are dying because the United States ground troops, the impact coming out, well, death. It's pretty simple. We don't want to stop death, but when they send more ground troops over there, all you're going to do is increase the amount of lives lost. Now, coming over to their case really quickly, their first contention was that the strike teams worked in the past. Cross-apply my first contention, which is the fact that, first of all, you can't send 1,000 to combat 200,000, as well as the fact that the last time we were in Iraq, it didn't work, 6 months there, and so it clearly does not work, so there's no example of a strike team working. And they talked about a Northern Allegiance Taliban. They said that, oh, well, when we sent them to Africa, it worked perfectly fine. Okay, well, then it worked perfectly fine, then why did the war continue? It clearly did not work. They say, oh, for the first 3 months it worked. Well, that's clearly not true. Then going to the second contention, they were talking about how it's more effective, less loss of lives killed by ISIS recruits and things such as that. Well, it's clearly not going to be effective when you're sending 1,000 to fight 200,000, as well as the fact that they were talking about, they had this whole block about drone strikes bad. Well, we're not doing drone strikes right now, so that doesn't really apply, and we're not advocating that we do drone strikes. We're advocating that we don't send ground troops, and we're not advocating that status quo solves. And then the whole thing about soft power that falls to because of cross-applying all my contentions. Low neg.
Would the judges like the order?
Yes.
Alright, so general overview of how this is going to go. I'm going to go T, neg, F. Before I begin my speech, just like to congratulate my opponents and partners and myself for making it all the way to finals, and all the judges for giving your time, and all the spectators for being here to make this happen. Okay, is everyone about ready? I'll wait till I'm done talking. Everyone's ready? I'm going to begin my time in 3, 2, 1. So, before I even jump into the actual debate itself, I'm going to talk a little bit about what debate is, like what debate essentially is. So when they ran this topicality shell and then immediately kicked it, they wasted over a minute just talking about how topicality should have been an issue, and then when they realized that they were just saying words to say words, they kicked it immediately. Keep in mind that the over a minute that they used talking about a tea that they themselves considered worthless it was wasted. It could have been time that they spent talking about the actual topic, educating everyone in this room about the actual topic. That loss of education is the a priority issue that you should vote on before you even vote on case. So, just as a general overview I'm going to now jump into the actual case itself, because it doesn't deserve that much time. Going on to the engagement case. So they said, as a whole, the status quo will solve the issue. The status quo will solve ISIS. But they take no action. And the action that they are forced to take, because the default after you don't use these strike teams, is drone strikes. They ignore the fact that drone strikes are the status quo. When we're talking about fighting ISIS in Syria, we have drones that are fighting ISIS in Iraq. So that's what they've accepted as their advocacy, because they didn't actually have a factual response to it. So going on to their first image about the status quo solving, they said that ISIS is shrinking. It's losing its territory, and we don't need the extra intervention. First off, why don't we end that suffering faster? If we have an alternative in the form of the strike team that can end the suffering of the people who are suffering from ISIS faster, why would we not take that opportunity? It is blatantly immoral to not take action when action can be taken to prevent human suffering. That is the most immoral thing possible, and because they're perpetuating that, they lose before I even have to say any more words. Secondly, they said that ISIS is just distracted from war by governing. Tell that to the hundreds of people that lost their lives this month from ISIS and ISIS-related issues. This entire point just blatantly ignores the facts that are happening in the status quo and is ignoring the fact that it's harming people because of the fact that they're accepting drone strikes. Secondly, going into the historical precedent that they said was set. They said that ISIS has 200,000 people, we only have 1,000, how does that solve? I thought they just said that ISIS is small now and that we don't have to worry about them. And then they said that 200,000 people are still active. They are a contradictory advocacy. Vote against them now. I'm going to tell you every single time you should vote against them, and that's going to be very often in this case. Going on from that, the fact that we have 1,000 troops does not mean that we're totally going to be ineffective. That 1,000 troops is 1,000 troops that Iraq didn't have before, and any life that is saved because of them is a significant impact, because we must consider all human lives sacred and valuable. Otherwise, we're dehumanizing the people in the Middle East because we're saying that their lives are worthless. So if we save lives during this policy, then we win this round. And keep in mind that we don't have an absolute burden as the affirmation to prove that we're solving every single problem that ISIS has. If we decrease human suffering, we win this round. That is the burden of the affirmation. If we prove that this is a good policy and will save life, then we win this round. So basically, their first and second contentions really are not relevant, not unique to this debate as a whole. Next, going to their point on anti-American sentiment, that when civilians die, ISIS gets bigger. If their default advocacy is drones, because that is the status quo that they're advocating for, the drone alternative, we already gave points in our first speech about how the drones actually create more anti-American sentiment than these strike teams would, because the strike teams would be working specifically with Iraq. First, drones are not working with Iraq, so that's already anti-American sentiment in Iraq. And third, this drone strikes do not have this unique advantages that strike teams do, including rescuing documents, rescuing hostages and civilians from certain situations. Drone strikes are really non-human. People can't relate to them. If we send in a strike team that protects hostages and civilians, that is uniquely pro-American sentiment, not anti-American sentiment. So at best for them, this contention is a wash. At best for us, this contention means that we actually promote pro-American sentiment. Going on to the fourth contention, that there is a loss of lives. Yes, there's a loss of lives. They said that U.S. intervention is the only cause, though. Keep in mind that strike teams have more oversight, more specific instructions, and more governance than any advocacy they have, which is drones. There's so much more we can do with oversight in Iraq, because drones are hackable, drones are fallible. Humans are not able to be hacked. That's just biology, guys. So next, they said that on average, U.S. intervention leads to loss of life. They did not give you specifics for how strike teams cause loss of life. When they give you the average, when they give you the entire average of how U.S. intervention gives you loss of life, they're ignoring the thing on the low end. They're skewing the data to account for every U.S. intervention. This is one specific U.S. intervention. They give you no unique evidence against it, therefore they lose that point. Going on to the affirmations case. So far, just to sum up, they have lost their entire case. Going on to the affirmation case, and why have we won every contention that we have presented to you so far? First off, going into the strike teams and the past precedent that they've had. They said that the war in Iraq and Afghanistan continue regardless of the fact that we pulled the strike teams. They said that because the strike teams didn't end it in 3 months, that was their fault. The United States pulled out its strike teams. Why they did it, we don't know why. The U.S. does strange things sometimes. But if the U.S. had kept the strike teams in Afghanistan, that war would have ended faster, because that was the rate of casualties that was going down as the U.S. strike teams were in Afghanistan. Keep in mind that they can also rescue hostages and documents, a unique benefit that is not in the status quo. So the past precedent of strike teams is that they're very, very good. That was not an offensive refutation to our point, and obviously, since I just refuted it, all of the advantages of this flow through. That we're saving lives, that we're promoting pro-American sentiment, and all of the advantages associated with that go to this contention. Going next into the fact that the alternative is unsustainable. I've gone over this with the negation case. Their only alternative is drones, because that is the status quo. They have claimed the status quo as their advocacy. They said that we aren't using drones, and I'd just like to point out to all of the judges that it's just factually inaccurate, and they're trying to dodge the question. We can't dodge the question when human lives are on the line. That is exactly the opposite of what we need to be doing when such a significant issue is presented to us. So keep in mind that that was not a refutation, because it's just not factual. So the fact that huge rates of PTSD, the fact that people are killing themselves because they're using drones, the fact that there aren't enough drone pilots to sustain an offensive motion against ISIS, we're going to stop fighting ISIS because they're not refuting this contention, and we're going to continue to kill civilians with the drones. The alternative that we have right now does not solve and actually has unique harms. We're solving those harms with the strike teams, making sure we have a sustainable alternative. And going lastly into our third contention, the fact that the soft power of the United States is immense, flow every benefit through it, that the soft power linked to hard power, how soft power creates hard power, and that can lead to prevention of global thermonuclear warfare. Flow that through, because the only responses they had to this contention were over time, so they don't count in this round. Do not count whatever responses they had over time in this round, because that is against parliamentary debate rules. For all of these reasons, I urge a vote in favor of the affirmation team. Thank you.
this order?
Yeah, I'm gonna just quickly go over the response to our topicality argument. Go off and then on. Okay. Starting time now. So first, their response to our topicality argument was to vote against us because we're being uneducational by wasting time. However, the only reason we ran this was because they were unclear with their wording. The first speaker specifically said we're not using ground troops, which is why we ran this in the first place. And then they come up in a POI and say, actually, these are ground troops, which is why it was unclear and then dropped. Okay, so that really just doesn't stand in this round. Okay, going into our case. So first, when we talk about how the status quo solves, they said that we're not taking action, thus we do not solve. However, if we look to the affirmations plan, really all they talk about is drones and how we default to drones. However, this is really non-unique to their world in saying that drones are ineffective. Drones are still going to be existent in their world. However, a large amount of drones are not present right now. And second of all, within their world, they only increase the amount of problems that they're talking about. One, because they have these drones still in place. Really, this is just a wash on both sides because it exists in both worlds, and they're not solving the problems within their world. And again, there are not drones going through, but if you even buy that they are, these it's not unique to either side. And their plan only increases the amount of U.S. Anti-U.S. sentiment that they're presenting. They're saying that drones have created these problems because of the loss in lives. Thus, since their plan it results in a loss of lives as well, then they're only increasing the amount of detriments that they bring up in relation to drones. Okay, going into historical precedent, they talk about how that we contradict ourselves by saying ISIS is small, or how we're saying that ISIS is small. However, we were not saying that it's small. We're saying that the presence within Iraq is decreasing right now. They have lost a large amount of cities within Iraq and have lost a large amount of their territory. Thus, we can see, though they do have a large presence, though they do have a lot of troops right now, we can see that it's decreasing the presence within Iraq. And by increasing the amount of ground troops that are present within Iraq, that only increases the amount of incentive that ISIS has to fight back within Iraq and increase its presence because they now know that they have to go fight the ground troops. Thus, in their world, they only increase the amount of lives lost because they're increasing the amount of incentive for ISIS to go back into Iraq. Yet right now in the status quo, their presence is waning. Okay, now, and this also impacts out to deaths, as we can see that with the Iraqi war, we can see that there were many lives lost. It was planned to last only 6 months, yet it lasted 8 years, and over 1 million lives were lost within this war. So this was with the use of ground troops, and then they say that they took out the strike forces that they're talking about within their plan. However, the reason they took them out was because they were ineffective. It's basic logic to see that the reason that they weren't still present within Iraq is because they did not work and were not effective in preventing terrorism from growing, which is why they were taken out in the first place. Thus, they cannot prove that they will be solvent with their plan because they really have no evidence on their side. Yes?
As my partner brought up in her first speech, the number of pilots we have for drones is drastically decreasing. Is the affirmation, or is the negation willing to accept that we will not fight ISIS at all once we don't have more drones?
So we're not advocating for an increase in drone strikes. We're advocating for the status quo right now. And we can see that only by increasing the amount of presence by the U.S. within Iraq will only increase ISIS's presence right now because we can see in the status quo it is decreasing. Okay, going into anti-U.S. sentiment, they talk about basically soft power, hard power, and they cross-apply their contention to this. We can see that we're increasing the amount of suffering by destroying the communities, and this only increases the amount of anti-U.S. sentiment towards the U.S., which increases the amount of support towards ISIS. So what happens here is more people are going to turn to ISIS, which only makes it grow even more, as well as the fact that by destroying communities, these people will have a lot of health detriment, which means that they have to pay for these health things to basically recover, which means that they have a low income. What happens is when we destroy these communities, now these people have to turn to terrorist groups as a source of income because that's all that they have. And we can see that as of March 2015, 250,000 innocent lives were lost within Iraq due to ground troops. Thus, we can see that what's going on right now is not going to be working. It's only going to be increasing the harm. Thus, we can impact out to poverty, saving lives, and decreasing dehumanization. Then 3, going into lives, they talk about strike teams, and how they solve. However, let me point out that they have not provided any specific examples in direct correlation to Iraq and how this is going to be solved. They said within the Iraqi war, they took out these strike teams. They said, oh, I don't really know why. It's basic logic to see that the reason they took these strike teams out is because they were ineffective. Thus, they cannot prove that they're going to be solvent at all. And since we have these statistics about how ground troops are ineffective and are killing innocent lives and are causing all these problems within these regions, we can see that none of their refutations stand. Okay, then going into their case. Now, first, they talk about how strike teams work. Then again, as you can cross-apply my argument, how they talk about how they pulled out strike teams within Iraq, you can see it's because they were ineffective, as well as the fact that there have been tons of innocent lives. And then they also talk about Africa. However, this just does not relate to the situation. They haven't paralleled how this specifically ties into Iraq right now, whereas we have provided specific examples of how lives are being lost through the presence of ground troops within Iraq. Then, two, they talk about how the alternative is unsustainable with drone strikes. Drone strikes still exist in their world, and they're saying that drone strikes increase violence and loss in lives, which increases the amount of presence in ISIS. And that still exists within their world, as well as the fact that they're increasing ground troops, and by increasing ground troops, that also increases lives lost. So you can see that all the impacts they're talking about with the amount of drone strikes also applies to what they're talking about with these ground troops, because they're also causing these loss of lives, which will only increase the amount of anti-U.S. sentiment. I'm in protected time. Okay. Then three, going into soft power, they talk about soft and hard power again. Again, this will not increase soft or hard power because it's increasing anti-U.S. sentiment. As we can see, you can cross-apply this point to their contention here. So we can see what's happening is, by increasing the amount of innocent lives lost, there's only an increase in amount of anti-sentiment towards the U.S., increasing the amount of reliance on ISIS as a source of income, which only increases the presence that's going on right now, and we shouldn't change what's going on in the status quo because there has been a decrease in ISIS's presence right now. So for these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the
Alright, is everybody ready? Alright, I'm just going about it. Starting time now. And thanks to everybody here. Congratulations to you guys for the final. Thanks to the judges, spectators. But going really quick, just going into these one issues for today. First one is you're going to read out and drop points. Now, I'd like to refer you back to our contentions. Like, if you really look at our contentions, they never actually really refuted our contentions. They pretty much just skirted around them and tried to say stuff that actually didn't apply. Going back to the first thing about the status quo solve, they said, oh, well, drone strikes are bad. You do drone strikes in the status quo. I really encourage you to look it up, and we repeated it multiple times turning around. The United States is currently not doing drone strikes in Iraq to combat ISIS right now, so that is not the alternative. Please Google that. Like, that is not going up right now. But even if it is, even if they're saying that they are, we're saying that they're not, it just becomes a wash in the entire round. So therefore, drone strikes doesn't even matter in this whole round, so that part of their plan falls. But what they never refuted was the fact is that ISIS is losing ground right now in Iraq. All they said was, oh, well, they're big. We said that they were small. Now they're big, and we're contradicting ourselves. But they never actually refuted the actual argument, which is the fact that ISIS is losing ground. They've lost 9% of their territory. They're focusing too much. They've lost major cities, and as well as the fact is that they are decreasing in size, so therefore that the status quo is currently solving. And since they never actually refuted that, then that whole entire contention flows through, and the impact of that contention also flowed through, and I please invite them to come up and try to refute that in their last speeches. And then going on to the historical precedent, they really dropped this. They bring up this whole example of, oh, well, it worked in Africa. It was working great for 3 months, then we pulled them out. They never had any examples of how it was actually working, and then we pulled them out. Why? Because it wasn't working? Use logic. I encourage you. Well, if it was working, we would have obviously left them there. They never refuted that, and so our entire historical precedent contention goes through to the fact that they can't fight 200,000 troops. And the fact of the matter is, as well as the fact is that lives will be lost for no reasons. All of our impacts coming out of historical precedent, it didn't work in Iraq in the past. It won't work in the future. They have nothing to combat that. All the impacts of that flow through. And the whole anti-U.S. sentiment thing, again, they just bring up drone strikes, which I told you, we win on that, and even if you don't believe it, it's in there washing around. It's he said, she said, he said, she said. It's pretty much just, a wash. But then the anti-U.S. sentiment, it's clear through through the contention of lies, where we talked about 250,000 civilians have been killed directly from ground troops, which links back to the anti-U.S. sentiment, which was just expanded upon in the anti-U.S. sentiment contention. They never refuted that. And if these people are dying because of this, they use it as propaganda. There's no refutations to that. There's no refutation to this anti-U.S. sentiment. All they bring up is drone strikes, which is a wash, so flow through the impacts. And then bringing you back to lives, their biggest response to this was they were like, oh, we don't have statistics about lives or anything like that. And they never refuted the 250,000 lives that have been lost in 2015 alone in direct correlation to ground troops. They never refuted that, and they cannot refute that in their final speech. So all the impacts of that flow through lives, dehumanization, and all these different impacts. So that flows through. So our entire case stands. Now, bringing you over to my second voter issue, which is going to be the fact of evidence. Now, I understand this is a policy round, but we also need evidence to back it up, whether that be concrete evidence or whether that be logic. Now, let's look at the evidence of the affirmation team side. Their whole idea is the fact that these troops, these special ops, I can't remember exactly what they called them, but these troops were perfect and they worked perfectly fine. But yet they were successful for 3 months, never told you what that actually means, and then they pulled them out and then the war continued. Okay, that's what their entire case relies on. If they can't prove that 1,000 troops is going to basically may have any impact without biting into any of our detriments, then we win. Yes, we grant them the fact that they just have to prove some solvency, but guess what? Their solvency does not compare to ours, which I will go to when I do my impact calculus, but basically going back to the evidence, they have no real evidence on their side through any of their contentions. They talk about strike teams work, it's effective, so you have less loss of life, but this is all just logical arguments based on the fact that these strike teams will be effective and that they will not bite into any of our detriments. If they bite into our detriments, they automatically lose. Bringing to an impact calculus. Okay, if you really look at what they have on their side, they talk about how we have effective. The strike teams worked in the past, which means we'll save more lives, we'll be more precise. Drone strikes are bad. Drone strikes is a what? They don't access those impacts. And they talk about soft power and all these different things. Okay, that's great. And if you want to, you can grant them some impacts coming out of that. They save some lives. But then you have to bring it over to the negation world. Is guess what? If they do this plan, first of all, we have offense in the fact that the status quo solves better. Status quo is actually in action, and we have evidence that it has been working. They have no evidence that it's been working, and then as well as the fact, so we gain the impacts there, that it is currently saving lives. It is currently defeating ISIS. As well as the fact is that we also gain the impacts that it will cause anti-U.S. sentiment, and it has caused anti-U.S. sentiment this year already. We gain the impacts because these impacts are currently happening right now. Anti-U.S. sentiment is happening right now. ISIS is trying to recruit right now using the ground troops' deaths that we have caused already this year. And ISIS is taking lives right now. Ground troops are causing lives to be lost right now. All of their contentions and all of their impacts are based on the logic that, guess what, these troops that they're sending are going to be perfect and we'll save a few lives. Guess what? Our plan allows for more lives not to be lost, and we also allow for more lives to be saved because lives are being saved right now greater than the number of lives that they will win. So when you really bring to it, who's really saving more lives? 1,000 ground troops or the things that are already working? Oh yeah, vote negative. Thanks, guys.
It was my pleasure to begin today's debate, and it is my pleasure to end it. And as I do so, I'd like to make you aware of 3 voting issues. So the first of which is that strike teams are good, and that's not something that our opponents have refuted. Now, refer to their case, and I'm literally going to be reading off of my partner's notes for this, so there's nothing new that I'm going to be saying here. Our opponents speak very generally about ground troops. The reason why we chose to use strike forces instead of ground troops is instead of regular ground troops, because they're all part of the United States military. That was the burden that our opponents set for them to be called ground troops, part of the United States military. The United States Special Forces meet that burden. So, what we're talking about here is strike forces as opposed to regular ground troops. And our opponents don't have anything against strike forces. They have nothing against our case. When our opponents say that ground troops are bad, they've caused 200,000 deaths, we ask them how many of those were because of strike teams, because we already know the answer is 0. There were no strike forces in them. So when our opponents say that ground troops cause anti-American sentiments, actually, let's look at their argument for causing anti-American sentiments. And this is also off of my partner's notes. Anti-American sentiments are caused by ground troops when civilians die, our opponents say, ISIS gets bigger. And that's our advocacy too. When civilians die, ISIS is able to recruit more. ISIS grows. And we say that the reason why we're using strike teams instead of regular ground troops, instead of the status quo, is because we want to solve that problem. Because we, as the affirmation, when we use strike teams, which we already proved to be, and here I'm going to ask you to throw away my opponent's logic that they pass off in the face of hard evidence. We say that in the first 3 months of the Afghan war, we as the United States solely employed the use of strike teams against the Taliban. After that 3-month period, when we instead switched to a fully invasive ground troop effort, that's when the war started to drag on. That's when we spent years and years and hundreds of thousands of lives fighting a war. But they say, well, strike teams must have been bad in the first place, right? Otherwise the United States wouldn't have gotten rid of them, right? Don't accept that as reasoning to discount our evidence, because it isn't reasoning to discount our evidence. So because, Judge, we argue that strike teams are good, and because our opponents have nothing against that, vote in favor of the affirmation. But secondly, the status quo is horrible, and that's what our opponents are forced into arguing for when they present no alternative. Now, disregard half of our drones case, but what we're saying here is that, in fact, with the status quo, we are using drones against ISIS. But that is an unsustainable system, because we cannot replace the amount of drone pilots that we're losing to PTSD. We can't train them fast enough. They're leaving too quickly. That means that in the very near future, we won't have any more drone pilots to pilot our drones. That means that our efforts against ISIS will very, very quickly stop. That the United States won't be fighting ISIS anymore, we'll be doing nothing. Our advocacy is that that's unacceptable. We can't allow any more loss of human life, any more slavery, any more injustice on the part of ISIS. We want to wipe them out as quickly as possible. And when our opponents advocate for the status quo, we say they're advocating for a system that will be gone within the next couple of years. In the next couple of years, there will be no more drone pilots, and as a result, our opponents won't be fighting ISIS at all anymore. So their advocacy, don't let them try to trick you, is not advocating for fighting against ISIS. So because they stand now on the side of not fighting ISIS, because they now stand on the side of the status quo, which includes the use of drones, which we already proved have a much higher incidence of anti-United States sentiment, because they are highly ineffective in these specific circumstances, and ISIS is already adapting to stop drone strikes as a means of eliminating them. We need to do something different. The status quo is not working. So we're the only ones then who provide an alternate, and that alternate then must win. So the status quo doesn't solve, but even if it did, we would still win this debate. Because we argue that if we save any lives, if we speed up the process of ISIS dying, well, that's a point for our side. Because we want to end human suffering faster. And if we can end it faster, the plan should be enacted, and the affirmation team should win. But third and finally, vote in favor of our third contention, which was left entirely unrefuted, about United States soft power, because we say that when Turkey and Canada joined immediately after the United States in the fight against ISIS, that means that we have the power to set a precedent against ISIS and fighting against ISIS, and that is a reason to enact the policy. So for those reasons, I urge your vote.
Would you like to leave the room?
Thank you.
Judges are not disclosing here. We're waiting until the votes.
Oh, wait,